Thank you for that wonderful and warm introduction. It is my pleasure to give this talk. Perhaps I'm a bit young to give to a distinguished audience such as this, but I'll take my risks. This title, Living with a Star, I have to confess, is not my invention. It's not something that I came up with, although it's such a nice title. It's the name of a huge program in NASA where they fund these sun-Earth climate studies and so on and so forth, and it's a very successful program. And but I was thinking, this name is really, I don't know, I really like the phrase. And for a long time, when Hamed said, "Would you like to come and give a public talk?" I thought, well, what should this be? And as the abstract says, sometimes we forget that the sun is actually a star with extraordinary and complex physics and a really, really interesting behavior that we do not see at all on Earth. There's nothing on Earth like the sun. There's nothing. Sometimes there are no analogies. It's so different. And with the sun, you can observe these things with tremendous accuracy, precision, resolution. And so I hope to amaze you today with all these fantastic movies that we have recently from satellite missions that observe the sun. So this is the most boring of slides, as it were. It's only plots. There are no movies. There's nothing. But there's a lot of information that I want to communicate. So sunspots are sort of the most, apart from the sun itself, the fact that there's this warm orb in the sky, sunspots, which are these black little features that appear on the sun, are sort of the face of the sun. And the Chinese knew of these 2,400 years ago, so they've been sort of observed for a very, very long time. Fast forward large, 2,000 years or more, and now here are a few things that we know about the sun. The sun has an 11-year cycle where its magnetic field reverses. It's like a bar magnet that flips every 11 years. So the north-south flips to south-north. And during this process, sunspots appear and disappear. So if you look at this, I have a pointer? No pointer? Anyway, so if you look at this particular plot, essentially in the beginning of a cycle, you have sunspots that appear. So on the horizontal axis is time. On the vertical axis is latitude. And every sort of orange dot there represents the appearance of a sunspot. And at the beginning of a solar cycle, things appear at high latitudes. Sunspots appear at high latitudes. And gradually, as the cycle proceeds, they appear closer and closer to the equator. And this is the famed butterfly diagram. And so you can see that essentially, every 11 years, there's sort of a gap between one butterfly and the next. And this is what is known as a solar minimum. And in a solar minimum, the magnetic field of the sun is very weak. And in a solar maximum, sort of the center of this butterfly, as it were, each butterfly, the magnetic field reaches sort of a maximum. And so the solar magnetic field encloses the entire solar system in its magnetosheath. So it's like a sheet that covers the entire solar system. And when the magnetic field is sort of at a maximum, there are all these particles that come from distant parts of the universe, cosmic rays. And these cosmic rays are deflected by this magnetic field when the field is strong. And when the magnetic field is weak, of course, these cosmic rays enter the Earth. So what you can do is, and it's a very interesting thing, you can see evidence of this essentially in tree rings. Tree rings contain information of solar cycles. You can see sort of a pattern of an 11-year turnaround. Glaciation, that is the melting of glaciers, is affected by essentially this 11-year cycle as well. And it's been theorized that the prehistoric atmosphere of the Earth was very sensitive or was much more susceptible to these fluctuations of the sun's magnetic field. In particular, what's a very, very interesting result was over the last 30 years, people have drilled ice cores in Antarctica. And when you take an ice core, essentially, the deepest part of the ice core dates to very, very long back, and the shallowest part of the ice core dates to present or contemporary times. And I mentioned to you that cosmic rays essentially enter the atmosphere of the Earth when the magnetic field is weak. It's not deflected by the magnetic field, so it just comes straight in. And so there are certain isotopes. Isotopes are certain chemicals that are affected, barium, and there's a certain type of carbon that is sensitive to these cosmic rays. So in other words, by studying these ice cores, you can sort of indirectly say how many cosmic rays have come in or not. And from that, you can infer what the strength of the magnetic field of the sun was. And so you can go back 11 millennia, 11,000 years, and you can say, how strong was the magnetic field of the sun 11,000 years ago? And we know how strong it is today. And so you have this, you could go back in time just by drilling these ice cores and studying them. What the amazing thing is, the amazing result that came out maybe like 10 or 15 years ago was that there's only one other time in the last 15,000 years or 10,000 years where the sun has been as strong. This is sort of the strength of the magnetic field. And today, this is the strength today. And you can see that there's been only sort of one other time in the last 10,000 years where the sun's magnetic field has been as strong. So in the past 80 years, the sun's magnetic field has been peculiarly strong. There are profound consequences to this. As I said, the sun affects our climate. And when the sun is at a maximum, or the magnetic field is at a maximum, the UV, the ultraviolet radiation from the sun also reaches a maximum. And so this affects our climate. So whenever there's a solar maximum, the luminosity or the luminous output of the sun increases. And so it affects and drives our climate. And so this led to the sort of, there was an argument going around for a while that somehow the peculiar maximum of the sun caused global warming or climate change, that this excess luminous output of the sun was doing it. But a much more careful analysis essentially showed that was unlikely to be the case, that anthropogenic or human-caused carbon dioxide output into the atmosphere was the sole or primary reason for global warming. But this is, this context is just to indicate to you how important it is to understand the magnetic field of the sun and to understand the properties of our star, because all our heat comes from the star. Well, most of it comes from the star. So here is sort of a rough summary of what we do and why we do it. I think these are the biggest, sort of the broadest questions. Of course, as scientists, we study more technical questions, but these are sort of the broadest driving goals of this entire field. So this is a picture of the sun from the International Space Station. It's really spectacular, I imagine. And there's a fantastic movie I'll show you at the end from a film of from the International Space Station. But essentially, if you're on the International Space Station, you have to be worried every time there's a solar flare or there's some high energy particles coming out from the sun. Because these high energy particles will come towards you, and so they're like high doses of radiation, so you have to be concerned. And so here are the reasons we study the magnetic field of the sun. It affects our climate, space weather. If you have satellites up in space and then there's a huge flare, the high energy particles that are released from the sun, it knocks out satellites. It affects our power systems on Earth. And there are ionospheric effects. So if you have an aircraft that's flying close to the pole or anything, and so this sort of stuff is really affected by magnetic fields of the sun. And so what we really study, what the questions that we study are the driving mechanisms of the solar magnetic variation. What drives it? What is the ultimate sort of mechanism that governs this? And what is it about these 11 years? Why 11 years? Why not 12? Why not 15? So on and so forth. And the ultimate goal, we don't even know if we can, we're still struggling with these two questions, but if we do understand these two, the ultimate goal is to be able to predict sort of what the magnetic cycle variations of the sun are. And this would be very, very important in planning for, future satellites or for sort of, all sorts of practical reasons. Okay, so this, a lot of the movies that I'm going to show you today are taken by this spectacular satellite called the Solar Dynamics Observatory, the SDO, as it's called, launched by NASA in 2009. It's about, as the statistic says, it's about 3,100 kilograms. Here are the rough dimensions. And there are 3 instruments. I'll play, it's a very nice movie, but I just want to show you the 3 instruments. This is the atmospheric imaging assembly that images or looks at the atmosphere or the outer layers of the sun. This is one of these, I don't know which one. One of these is the Helioseismic and magnetic imager, which looks at the surface of the sun. And the other one is the extreme ultraviolet variability experiment, and that looks at the luminous variations of the sun. So it's a nice animation of what the satellite's looking at. It's in geosynchronous orbit, which means it's timed very similar, where the day and night are similar to, it's in an orbit that's specific to that, and it's looking at the sun in this particular way. And these instruments are essentially recording the sun in different parts of the light that come in here. So you can study the sun at various layers, and the sun is actually invisible in the interior. It's kind of like the surface of the Earth. You can't really see within. It's optically inaccessible. You can't really see within. So the sun's surface is kind of like that. This is the sun's. This is an image of the sun, but what you can do is you can look at different heights above the surface of the sun. So here is what is known as the surface or the photosphere of the sun, and you're just looking at this one particular height. And then you sort of move higher up, and this is known as the chromosphere of the sun, and you see a lot more activity, a lot more stuff going on, and there's all these like bright and dark regions. And then you go to ultraviolet, and this is even higher up in the sun, and you see this emission of ultraviolet rays. So what's happening is the sun is emitting a huge range of different types of light. It's called it's visible light. That's the stuff that we see directly of the sun. Then it's ultraviolet that we don't really see but affects us, and all sorts of stuff in between. And so by studying different parts of the light, you can see at different depths of the sun, or at different layers of the sun. So in this particular movie, you saw 3 different layers: the surface, the chromosphere, which is above the surface, and the corona, which is very, very far above the surface. And the corona, all stars have coronae, a lot of stars have coronae, and the corona is a very interesting part of the sun as well, for reasons that I will describe later. And I just want to point out that you can calculate how much energy the sun produces, and it's an enormous number. It's a really, really enormous number. And the entire planet, the human civilization, the energy consumption rate is but a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of this luminosity of the sun. And sometimes we forget how powerful or how large the sun is. From this distance, we forget how remarkable this object is. There's nothing on Earth that we know that could produce this kind of energy. So it really is quite remarkable. So here's an example of what I was talking about earlier, was this magnetic regions that cause solar flares or high energy particles that are released. This movie was taken by this remarkable satellite called Hinode, which is a Japanese-American mission, joint mission. It currently still orbits the sun and still taking images, though not with as much success anymore, but here we go, sorry. So you're zooming in to what is known as a sunspot. This is a sunspot. And you see a sunspot has this dark core in the center and sort of this complicated stuff, furry, it's like kind of like some fur, furry sort of exterior. This is known as the umbra, the central region of the umbra. I'll play this movie again and I'll go through what it means. But the central region of the sunspot is known as the umbra. It's dark. It's very, very dark. It's because it's very cold. It's much colder than, so the temperature outside here is 5,700 Celsius. And the temperature inside is typically 4,700 Celsius. So it's much, much cooler in the interior. And this is the penumbra, the furry region that surrounds it. This is like think of this as like a thick magnetic tube, sort of, that's coming out from the interior. And what you're seeing here, and as I said, the sun emits light, different types of light. So you're seeing these different types of light from visible radiation or visible light to ultraviolet. And the most remarkable thing, the thing that we still don't understand about the sun, one of the things that we don't understand about the sun are how so what you're seeing right now, I'll tell you when it is, right now, that's a flare. That's a flare. That's what's happening is, and you see this particularly in this type of light, there's a huge amount of energy that's being released here. And what's happening is these magnetic fields are like elastic bands, and they're snapping and they're reconfiguring. And when they do that, there's a huge amount of energy that's released. And these flares are what really affect space weather. Every time one of these flares happens, and this is a dramatic example of something like this. Here's this. There you go. So you're looking at the corona now. This is the higher layers of the sun, and you see this huge blast of radiation that comes out, and then the plasma falls back in, or the fluid falls back in. And these are you see these spectacular magnetic. These are magnetic fields stretching from one point to another. They go up into the outer layers and then come back within, and then when a flare happens, you have this release. This stuff is shot out like this, and this stuff comes towards us. It comes to satellites. It affects Earth. There's a huge number of high energy particles that it releases, and then it falls back down because it cools down, or all sorts of complicated things are happening. And this is again taken by this is taken by the Solar Dynamics Observatory. Here's another example of a flare. Sorry. So what's happening here is that you have this fluid that's being ejected outwards, and then some of it falls back in, but then some of it gets just thrown out. And again, the reason for this is it's a very, very complicated magnetic, so there are magnetic lines of force sort of connecting points in the sun like this, and something is happening. They're reconfiguring, they're reconstituting themselves, and every time that happens, or sometimes when it happens, the energy with which and the fury with which that happens is so high that this fluid is ejected outwards, and all sorts of very complicated dynamics is happening right here. And you can estimate what the energy of this flare is, and this is sort of a rough estimate. If there were a way where you could go in and say, well, I'm going to try to harness all this energy, like we do wind energy or ocean energy or something. If you could do flare energy, you're set. All of our energy problems are set for the next whatever foreseeable future. But there's obviously no clear way to come in. The layers here are millions of degrees hot, and so there's no real clear way to go over there and try to extract the energy. Again, this is taken by the Solar Dynamics Observatory. So I've introduced you broadly to the spectacular and violent atmospheric phenomena of the sun. And once again, I just want to reiterate that there's nothing on Earth quite like this. We could try small experiments on the scale, but the sun is huge. It has this incredibly complex dynamics, and we don't really fully understand how it happens, and we cannot replicate it on Earth. So here's a redux, the sun redux. You see here is the core of the sun, the deepest layer of the sun. The sun is roughly a sphere, and the deepest sort of core here is nuclear fusion happens. So essentially, atoms of hydrogen are knock against each other, and when the hydrogen they're pushed against each other with so much force that it becomes helium. And this is nuclear fusion, and when that happens, you have a huge amount of radiation or energy that's released. Nuclear fusion is long thought of to be one of the sources of perennial energy on Earth, and it's a long sought after goal on Earth to create controlled nuclear fusion. It's not a successful one yet, but the sun has it, and that's how so much energy is produced. And then from the core, you have this huge amount of energy that's being released, and these light sort of transports this. There's this light that I was talking about, the different types of light. So light sort of transports it from here to over here. And this is the radiative zone, where radiation or light transports the heat. And then the outer third of the sun is something called a convection zone. Convection is something that you can witness at home. If you take a pan of water and you heat it from the bottom, the hot water rises from the bottom and then comes up to the top, cools down, and falls back in. That's sort of what's happening here. You have heat from this region heating up these lowermost layers of the convection zone. These rise, they go up to the surface, they emit their heat, and they fall back down. So this is what is termed as, this classically termed as the solar interior. And the solar interior we cannot see with our, I mean, it's invisible you can't really see within it. So the sun sort of becomes visible here on, you see this sort of cut over here. The sun, that's the photosphere or the surface of the sun. And then we start to see it, and I'll show you some really impressive movies of that as well. And then as you go outwards, you have this upper layers of the sun called the chromosphere. I described that a minute ago, where you saw the different layers of the sun. And then you have the corona. And the corona is a big puzzle. There's a big puzzle called the coronal heating. The corona is so hot that the parts of the corona are at 15 million Kelvin, 15 million Celsius, roughly. But the core itself is also at 15 million Celsius. So it turns out that parts of the corona are hotter sometimes than the core itself. And so this is like a big, long-standing puzzle, the coronal heating mystery or puzzle. And we still, to date, don't exactly understand what drives coronal heating, or how it's able to be, some parts of it are so hot that it's hotter than the core itself. So there's lots of it starts to get extremely complicated in these regions. We don't really have a very clear understanding of what's, we have some theories, but it's very complicated, basically, these regions. There are flares. You saw these movies of these flares. They happen quite often. They're essentially these magnetic fields that are very twisted, and they snap and they reconfigure. And when that happens, there's huge amounts of energy and radiation are thrown out towards us sometimes. Yes, and so this is sort of the structure of the sun itself. And then there are these other mysterious things called prominences, and these are again quite mysterious. It's suddenly like there's this huge region of fluid that sort of hangs out above the sun. We don't really know what supports this or why it hangs out there. But it's quite large, it just sits there sometimes for weeks on end. So moving to helioseismology, or the seismology of the interior of the sun. So seismology to the uninitiated is kind of like it's like if you were to walk into a dark room and if you were to yell in the dark room, you could sort of tell its rough dimensions, because what you hear is you're shouting, it bounces at the end of the room and comes back. Or like how bats, for example, navigate. They're sort of sending sound waves, and the sound waves reflect and come back, and they're constructing this complicated image. Even more impressive are certain eels in South America, and it's in the Amazon, where there's incredibly muddy water, so it's impossible to see anything. Well, what these eels apparently do is they're emitting an electric field in this region. And this electric field is, they're able to reconstruct from the way the electric field behaves what their structure around it is. And it's pretty sophisticated. So what they're doing essentially is seismology in some sense. They can't really see what's happening, but so you try to use other means to reconstruct what's happening around you. And so this is the sort of the goal of understanding the interior of the sun, what's happening in the interior. And there's some spectacular results, very interesting results, which I'll describe in a minute. But so we can't see in the interior, and the question is, how can we image, or how can we see, not quite see in the classical way, or how can we infer what's happening in the interior of the sun, or can we? And it turns out that you can. Just like bats, as I said, they emit these sound waves that go out and they reflect, and then they reconstruct this image of their surroundings. Just like that, there are sound waves within the sun. And I'll play for you how the sound waves, actually how the sun sounds. It's quite peculiar. Here's like, it was discovered in 1954. There are sound waves, just like, as I said, the bats. And they oscillate. The sun is like pulsating. It's like, think of it as like a giant ball of something, of like jelly or something, as I said in my abstract. So there's like stuff is like pinging all over the place, and this entire thing is oscillating, like a ball of jelly. It's squeezing in and out, and the entire thing is all sorts of incredibly complicated sort of ways in which it can vibrate. So the entire sun as a ball of gas is vibrating. And these oscillations, it's been discovered subsequently that these oscillations are all excited at the surface. I told you there's this overturning convection thing, this thing that heats up from the bottom and cools at the top. So when it goes to the surface and it falls down, it sort of is a little ping. It like gives it, like, so if you think of this as the sun, there's a little ping, there's little pings all over. Kind of like you have a chisel and you're sort of, pinging at the surface. So it's all over the sun. And here is a nice movie of, so it looks like your TV screen when you don't have anything playing. It's like, all sorts of random fluctuations happening in the entire sun. And it's just oscillating like this. The entire sun is oscillating like this all the time. It's oscillating all the time. And so the goal is to study these waves. And you study these waves, and then you can say things about the interior of the sun. I won't really explain this. This is sort of more technical, but this is the way in which we create these images. I'll ignore that for now. So here is a movie, a very nice movie, of the excitation of these waves. So I told you that what's happening is this is the surface of the sun. This is what I said was the photosphere. It's taken by this instrument called Hinode that's still taking measurements. And you sort of see the entire screen moving left and right. And that's because the satellite itself is sort of swishing left and right. We removed that usually, but in this particular movie, that hasn't been removed. But what's happening is, again, very complicated dynamics. So these are called granules, these little things. And what's happening is hot fluid comes up from the interior. You're only seeing the surface, right? You're only seeing one layer. That's the surface. The hot fluid sort of comes up from the interior. It comes right up to the surface, and those are the bright parts in the center. It cools down. It sort of emits all its radiation, and so all its heat is sort of emitted. And then it sort of falls back down. And that's the dark. These are the dark lanes inside. So this is happening at roughly. So this is real time over here, and each granule sort of stays alive for 15 minutes. So fluid comes up, cools down, falls back in. Over and over again, all over the sun, every 15 minutes, a new granule is born. Every 15 minutes, a granule dies, and another granule occupies its space. Yeah, I think that's good for this. And so every time, one last thing. You see these dark lanes. Every time, I told you that there's this sort of a shock. There's a ping that's how waves are excited. So every time this fluid cools down and falls back within in these dark lanes, it falls back really hard into the sun and sort of hits the sun like this. Cools down and bam. And every time that happens, sound waves are released. So there are sound waves being released constantly all the time. Every time you see a dark lane, a sound wave is being released. So there are little pings all over the surface of the sun all the time, constantly. This is what creates seismic waves. Okay, so I want to play these. I hope this will work. It's really quite fantastic. So this is, okay, so let me explain what this is. I'm playing for you the sound of the sun. But the sound of the sun itself happens at a very low frequency. So human ears can hear between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. 20 to 20,000, right? Is that right? Yeah. So, sorry? 3,400. Okay. So yeah. So that's 20 hertz is sort of the minimum frequency we can hear. But the frequency of the sun itself is what is 3 millihertz. It's like 0.003. So it's essentially like oscillating very, very, very slowly. So you can't even hear it. It's infrasound. It's like ultrasound and infrasound. So you can't actually hear it. So my colleague, actually, Tim Larson, he was a PhD colleague of mine at Stanford, a very nice guy. He once told me, he's in his 10th year of PhD, so he just really likes to be a PhD student. And he once told me that he wants to hear if the sun is speaking to us. I don't know if you know, but when the Eagles released Hotel California for many years, people said, if you play it in reverse, there's this like secret dark incantation or something, and all these like little urban legends. So he said, well, let's see if the sun's actually speaking to us. And so what he did was he took the sound of the sun. As I said, the sun oscillates in all these different configurations. And he said, well, let's take a particular configuration of the sun where it sort of like does this, like this a certain way. So we have the ability to analyze the vibrations of the sun and say we want to look at that particular way in which it vibrates. And so what he did was then he sped up. As I said, it's 3 millihertz, so it's oscillating very, very slowly. So he sped that up. He said, well, what if you sped it up to human ear sounds, like the sounds that we could hear? So here's a... Can you hear? This? Oh, sorry. That's not the sun. Yes? Sorry, this is very confusing because that could also be the sun, but it's not. Let's try this. Anyway, it's very austere. It's like this. It's very mysterious. Actually, I didn't think it would sound very interesting, but it sounds quite mysterious. I wish you could hear it. It's kind of like this. Anyway, that's unfortunate, but it's a very mysterious sounding. So there is maybe the possibility that the sun is speaking to us. It doesn't rule it out altogether, but these are 5 different sort of ways in which the sun oscillates, and they really do sound quite mysterious. And so typically people in the field, when Tim told me a funny story, he said he went to a technical conference where everyone is a seismologist essentially, and he said, here's how the sun sounds. And I think everyone dismissed him outright because they said, this is useless. But I think it's actually quite cool if you were to go out and listen to it. It's very interesting. Anyway, so okay, so to get back to this, here's how the sun's rays. So this is how the acoustic waves move or propagate, as we call it in the sun. They're excited at the surface, as I said, and they sort of bounce around within. You see waves bouncing within, and some waves go really deep in the interior of the sun. Some waves are only very shallow and very close to the surface. So they're sort of different. As I said, the sun oscillates in different ways. And in this particular, the blue line tells you that the sun oscillates in a way that it's the entire interior is not oscillating. But the red stuff, the entire sun is essentially pulsing back and forth. And when we look at this, it has a full spectrum of modes. The entire sun is breathing. There's the L equal to 0, as we call it, where the entire sun is like squeezing and expanding and squeezing and expanding. And that was one of these. Very, that's this one, L equal to 0, right here. Very spectacular. It's a very interesting mode because that's the deepest mode of the sun. That's the breathing mode of the sun. And then all of the others, there are these shallow modes like the blue lines. And so you have a full spectrum of modes, and then you use these different waves and you say, well, I want to look at the deepest part of the sun. Then you look at the breathing mode of the sun. And you say, well, I want to look at the shallow part of the sun. Then you look at the blue waves. And so you can sort of separate this out, and you can say, you can study the full 3-dimensional interior of the sun using these different waves. And in many ways, it's like you perform an MRI. You go into that ghastly tube, and this thing is spinning around you. No one can see within your brain, but you can sort of do an MRI and sort of infer what's happening inside your brain. And that's very, very similar to what we do for the sun. We see the surface, we don't see inside, but we infer by studying all these waves that go very deep within or shallow, like this. So I want to tell you a couple of really interesting stories, actually. The first one, or rather the first story, is very interesting. Just to outline what the most important results are in the sun, we understand the temperature of the very deepest in the internal layers, the entire temperature from the deepest to the shallowest. We understand We understand it. We know it with tremendous precision and accuracy. We know how the sun rotates. The sun is a rotating ball of fluid, and we know how it rotates in the inside. We sort of, as I said, we infer the entire rotation rate of the interior of the sun. We know how deep the convection zone is. This is a very, very important thing. It may not appear important at the outset, but it's actually a fundamental quantity in sort of the evolution of stars and so on. We know the age of the sun much more precisely. We know it's about 5 billion years old now. Now, in contemporary helioseismology, I'll briefly describe this. We study the 3D properties, like what's underneath the sunspot. Questions like this, we study these. This is sort of one of the most interesting, the solar neutrino problem. This is a classic sort of a helioseismology success story. So, okay, what are neutrinos? Neutrinos are these tiny, tiny particles which are invisible to the human eye. And as I stand here, billions of them are sort of coursing through me. They're just going through me. Neutrinos don't really interact with matter. They just go through matter. And what happened is in the 1970s or the late 1960s, people have wanted to detect neutrinos. They wanted to see how many neutrinos were coming from the sun. So what they did is they went to a mine in Detroit or somewhere in America, very deep into the mine, and then they installed these detectors. And you have to go very deep underground to do this because there's too much noise near the surface. So only neutrinos, as I said, they just keep streaming straight through. They don't see rock. They don't see the Earth. They don't see you. They don't see me. They just go straight through. So they put these detectors very deep underground where most other particles would have been, like scattered off or just blocked from going deep down. So these neutrinos, they're very deep down. And what they discovered in the 1960s, the classic Davis and what's his name? Can't remember the other person's name, but very famous person. But anyway, so it's a very classic experiment, salt mine in Detroit. And they discovered that the number of neutrinos they expected was a third, or the number of neutrinos they measured was a third of the number of neutrinos they expected. And the reason why I say expected is for the temperature of the core, we have models that tell you what the temperature of the core of the sun is. So we know what the central temperature is. From that, we can estimate the nuclear fusion. I told you that hydrogen strikes each other and then you have helium. And when this happens, when this nuclear fusion reaction happens, you have neutrinos that are released. And so when they measured and went out and measured the number of neutrinos that were coming out from the sun, they found only a third of what they expected. And this was a great puzzle. This was a great mystery. And for many years, people didn't know what was going on, and they went and made more and more experiments, and they still only kept discovering a third of the number of neutrinos they expected. So either something was fundamentally wrong with the experiment, something was fundamentally wrong with our theory, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all these plausible causes that were outlined, the causal relationship to these discrepancies, till helioseismology came along in the 80s, and we were able to measure very, very precisely, with tremendous precision and accuracy, the core of the core temperature of the sun, and we found that it was exactly what had been known before. So helioseismology suggested that some flux of neutrinos, so the number of neutrinos that would come out, and they were still detecting only a third. So they thought, oh, but helioseismology must be wrong. So they pointed the finger at us. Well, we stood strong. This is the great story. Well, not me, but my colleagues, my now elderly colleagues. So they stood strong, and they said, no, helioseismology is right. We know the core temperature of the sun. We know this is what it is. There is no discrepancy. And the reason they knew this is that they knew the star. I told you there are these breathing modes of the star itself, of the sun itself. And from these models of seismology, you know what the frequency of these breathing modes is. And they're able to, the theories matched the observations with tremendous precision and accuracy. So they said, no, we can't be wrong. It just cannot be. It's just we know our models too well. So in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, 3 Russian physicists, or 2 Russian and someone else, I can't remember exactly, but they came up with this theory. They said, well, what could be happening is the neutrino is jumping from flavor to flavor. They said there were these flavor oscillations of neutrinos. So there are 3 types of flavors. There's, and the neutrino jumps from one to the other. And it's constantly switching between these flavors. Because there are 3 flavors, and these detectors are only seeing one type of flavor, so that's why you see a third of these neutrinos. Of course, and the most remarkable conclusion to come out of this would have been, so this is all theory, this is all theoretical at this point. The most remarkable conclusion is that neutrinos would then have a tiny mass. So they thought neutrinos were massless particles that had no mass. They would just go straight through. But this, if it was true that neutrinos jumped from one flavor to another, then they would have a tiny mass. And you see, the remarkable thing, the most remarkable thing is if they did have a mass, and there's this outstanding puzzle called dark matter that fills our universe. We only see a tiny fraction of all the matter there is in the universe. We know it's there because it's pulling gravitationally at our galaxies. It's changing the rotation rate of our galaxies. We know it's there, but we don't see it. We don't know what this dark matter, to date, we don't know what dark matter is. So if neutrinos had this tiny, tiny mass, and there's so many neutrinos in the galaxy, there's just billions of them coursing through you and me all the time. So if it were true that neutrinos had mass, then this would mean, this could have explained dark matter. So very remarkable sequence of conclusions, a causal chain that would veritably change the understanding of physics. There were particle physics, a new theory of neutrinos. There was dark astrophysics, dark matter, the explanation for dark matter. There's remarkable conclusions, all hinged on the core temperature of the sun. So anyway, so as I said, helioseismologists held strong, and 15 years later, there were 2 experiments, seminal experiments, in the very, very complicated experiments. Super Kamiokande in Japan, again, deep in a mine with heavy water, deuterium. It's a type of water. It's not normal water. It's heavy water. There's this giant tank of heavy water deep underground, and they put these little detectors. And neutrinos are so hard to detect. They're so hard. You have like you detect 3 neutrinos a month or something because they don't interact with it. They just keep going through. So you have to wait for the one that somehow accidentally interacts. And you can't expect more than 10 or 15 interactions like this a month. So anyway, so there's Super Kamiokande, and there was this snow experiment in Canada. And they waited for years to measure the neutrino fluxes. And they finally discovered these 2 different flavors. And for this remarkable discovery, they were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2001 or 3 or something. Both of these experiments, very, very remarkable experiments. Unfortunately, though, we thought that with one grand sweep you could explain everything. Unfortunately, the mass of the neutrinos was insufficient to explain dark matter. So it's still an unknown what dark matter is. But it changed the face of particle physics as we know it. I was reading a funny story about this Super Kamiokande, which is I told you this is an experiment in Japan that was unfortunately damaged by the Tohoku earthquake a couple of years ago. But they were reinstalling some detectors. They're still trying to detect different types of neutrinos. And so there are these tiny detectors that are tremendously expensive. Like each one is thousands of dollars. And one of them flashed by accident. So it's a funny picture. You can Google this. They go deep down, and there's this clean, pure, heavy water, the deuterium water. And so they go in these little the dinghies. They go in these little flotation dinghies, and they paddle their way and they install these detectors. It's a funny picture to look at. It just seems elaborate and sort of weird. But anyway, so they go deep down, and one of these flashed by accident, destroyed all of the Cherenkov, they're called Cherenkov detectors, hundreds of them. I mean, it was like a huge expense, a tiny mistake, and then bam, it's gone. Anyway, so it goes to show how hard people try how many years it's taken. From 1965 to 2003, this outstanding problem of the number of neutrinos from the sun remained unanswered. So John Bacall, that's the other person that I was thinking of. So these people have contributed, to these seminal. These are all most of them are helioseismologists. They've contributed very significantly. And this one tells you what this is percentage of error. So here is the sound speed of the sun as a function of depth in the interior. This is the core of the sun. This is the surface of the sun. This is the error between the model and the observation in some sense. And the error is 0.004%. So we know it with tremendous accuracy and precision. We know this. We know this now. So it's a very remarkable conclusion of helioseismology. The internal rotation of the sun, which I won't really go into detail. I did want to point out that I'm not a hoax. That I wanted to point. I was told my father told me you have to put one paper of yours to indicate that you're not a hoax. So I have worked on this problem, and we had a paper last year on this. So the sun rotates. In the 1970s, they thought, we understand we understand everything about the sun. There's a famous scientist whom I won't name, but he said, in 10 years we'll know everything about the sun. And he predicted that the sun would rotate. We couldn't see the sun inside the sun yet at that point. So he predicted the sun would rotate in a specific way. Then helioseismology went in and said it rotates in a much more complicated, much less understood way. Even to date, it is not understood how the sun and why the sun rotates in this peculiar way. And that's why I say rotation and convection anomaly. It's an anomalous thing. We don't really quite understand what the situation is. I don't want to. This is much more technical, and the story is not quite as exciting as the solar neutrino problem. So I want to wrap up with telling you what we do at the moment and some very nice movies to end this with. So contemporary helioseismology is big data. It's like the catchphrase now. There are trillions and trillions of observations, and we have to assimilate this. We have to use this in our models, and it's much more complicated than those beautiful, what is the structure of the sun sort of questions. We want to understand sunspots. We want to know what's underneath sunspots. We want to know how this sunspot comes up. We want to know what the sun has these large-scale circulations inside. We want to know what these are. What is the sun's plumbing look like? Like what is it that maintains the star? What is it that maintains the magnetic field of the sun? Quite literally the plumbing of the sun. We want to understand that, and it's not a simple question. It's really not a simple question. And gone are those days when the results could be explained with a few equations or could stand it. Now these analyses are very complicated. They're both theoretically complex. They're both observationally to extract these data are not easy. So these are that is the unfortunate aspect of contemporary seismology. Even perhaps one might say contemporary science has grown enormously complicated, enormously specialized, and it is no longer that easy to explain what we do in its full glory. But I want to point out two people here in the audience. One is Hamid and Paul Callie, who's somewhere. I don't know where he is, but there he is. So they're in the Monash group here, and there's several students sitting here in the front. Very, very clever. Paul Callie and I've known for a while, as I've known Hamid. They do really, really important work here in solar physics, sort of pushing the field forward theoretically, computationally. And once again, I have to thank them for allowing me this privilege. So this is a very nice movie. It shows the emergence of magnetism. It's more dramatic than it is, but it shows the emergence of these magnetic spots and structures. And again, taken by this satellite, Hinode. So it's moving really fast. You can see all these granules. Those are the granules that I was telling you about earlier. And then you have these dark things are magnetic fields. They come out. They come out in this complicated. Who knows how they come out? But you start to see the stuff. You start to see. You're watching in real time, and then these magnetic fields come out like this. This is how sunspots are formed. Actually, there's probably a sunspot over here on this side. But this is how sunspots in large magnetic regions in the sun form. It's quiet, everything's nice, no problems, and then suddenly this giant, this isn't that big even. These are small little flux tubes, but you see this stuff coming out. Now here's a more remarkable. So we're looking at the face of the sun, taken by the Solar Dynamics Observatory. We see the emergence of these little. They're propagating across the face of the sun, or the sun is rotating really. And these they don't quite make it. They sort of vanish. Well, you have something much bigger that comes out here. So keep in mind that the sun is basically rotating all the time. It's a rotating ball of gas, so it's sort of rotating away from us. You see these flux tubes. But you didn't even, the question is, can you predict this? Can you tell when these things will come out? And these are the ones that flare and cause these giant energy bursts that are problematic. I want to show that movie again just to show you how, you can't really even predict when it's going to come out. Or I'm sorry?
How long does the sun
the rotation period of the sun is 28 days. 28 Earth days. Yeah.
So is it likely that you'd see that for a fortnight, is it? From left to right, more or less?
About 8 or 9 days, 10 days. Because it depends on how long they live. And so one of the questions, in fact, is how long can you observe a thing like this? So these I told you, so you can't, this is, so it's not a high resolution picture, it's a low resolution picture because you're sort of looking at it from far away. But if you were to go in, you would see these granules that I was describing, those little overturning cells. But these granules have 20-minute lifetimes. They're like overturning every 20 minutes. But these things last for 10 days, and we don't again understand how these things are stable for so long. These things are violent, they're trying to destroy things. They're trying to pull it apart, but they survive for about 10 days. So it's again a puzzle that we. So there's a very nice simulation. So people do calculations now. They do these giant numerical simulations. And here is an example of one by a scientist called Matthias Rempel, who's in the US. And sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this. Yes. So what he's doing is he's letting in so this is a vertical section. This is a vertical section. This is a horizontal section. So this is a numerical calculation. This is not the sun. This is not, these are not observations. And one of the questions he's asking is, how do these magnetic fields come up to the surface? And so here's, in this numerical simulation, which is extremely realistic. They take into account very complicated physics, very remarkable. Millions and millions of CPU hours are burnt on computing this. And this is the surface of his simulation. And this is the sort of the vertical section. So he's taking a vertical section. It's a three-dimensional thing. So he's taking a vertical section. And he releases this little flux, he releases this tube. And that's a flux tube. That's what we call this magnetic tube. So it sort of rises up and it forms. And you can see that, if I were to ask you, are these observations or are these, if I were to remove this and ask you, are these observations or are these simulations? It's kind of hard to tell because they're getting really good sometimes at predicting this. And this to explain the formation of sunspots. Sunspots always come in pairs. That's the thing about sunspots. It's like you could think of it as a tube that goes up and comes back down. It's a tube that's rising up. It pierces the surface of the sun, and this part of the sunspot is sort of the leading one. It's sort of coming up. This is the following sunspot, maybe, or depending on how you define it. So they always come in pairs. And here's an example. You have a sunspot here. You have a sunspot here. You have this. Shall I play that again, or? Yes, they are field lines. They're essentially, it's a tube of field lines. That's exactly right. I'll play that again. It's nice. At the moment, helioseismology is still sort of, these problems are extremely complicated. They're very, as you can see, it's a very complicated thing. So helioseismology hasn't yet quite succeeded at understanding. So just to explain again, what he does is he releases a tube of field lines that are horizontal, and it sort of rises up like this, and it gets distorted. As you can see, what's happening here, and this is just the magnetic field itself. And
sunspots
So, I mean, flares are essentially when the magnetic field lines associated with the sunspot reconfigure. So they're sort of jostled around by these granules, and they get twisted and twisted and twisted, and they don't like that. And then so they snap and they reconfigure. And when that happens, that's a flare, essentially. But that could happen for other reasons as well. A prominence is this giant mass of cold fluid that just hangs out above the sun. I mean, it just hangs out for weeks sometimes. Very puzzling, quite puzzling actually. So these dark things that you see here, essentially magnetic field that's coming up. The magnetic field, as you can see, does not allow these granules, these little things that you see here, they don't like it, so they sort of prevent granules. But granules want to be granules, and so they fight against the magnetic field. So it's this fight between the two. And you would think, naively, that these granules would win this fight. But they don't. They lose the fight for weeks. Hundreds and thousands of granules lose the fight to these sunspots. So we don't know why that is. Sometimes a little bit of hot fluid comes from the center, despite the magnetic field saying, no, I will not allow you to come up. Sometimes it sneaks in. You see these bright points in the center right here. So it's very complicated, and as I said, there's nothing on Earth quite like this. So I'm sort of coming to the end of this talk. I just want to say that we look at the sun, right? So there's this dichotomy of philosophy and understanding stellar physics and understanding stars. You can look at one star, like the sun, which you look at with very high resolution. So you have an enormous amount of information on one star. Or you can look at lots and lots of stars that are far away, but you have little pieces of information. You can't see very much because they're very far away, but sort of see very, very basic things. So you can do surveys of large numbers of stars, and little pieces of information from each. Or you can look at one, or you can do both, of course. So this is the sun. This is the galactic plane. Our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, is a spiral galaxy. There's a bar here. There's a spiral galaxy. We're in the Orion spiral, as it's called. These red things that you see here are essentially clumps of stars that are radiating, or young stars that are very hot. There's a giant black hole at the center of our galaxy, and within our galaxy alone, there are over 300 billion stars. There's estimates are sort of broad, between 100 and 400 billion stars. It's an enormous, enormous number of stars. So you could survey these stars, or some fraction of them, and understand physics about them. So these basic questions we ask about the sun, we can ask about stars. We can say, well, how do these stars operate? What do their magnetic fields look like? Is the sun an outlier? What is the physics of these? Some of these stars, they're like footballs. The sun is almost a sphere. Some stars are like footballs, like they're just deformed because they're rotating so rapidly. They break up. What's happening with these stars? Like, what is the physics of these stars? Increasingly, as I sort of age I don't know if I'm an astrophysicist, because people who study the sun are sort of poo-pooed by astrophysicists because the sun isn't considered astrophysical enough, right? It's right there. So anyway, but increasingly when I sit in these talks, I sort of wonder, like, we're here. We're like on a little rock, a wet rock that's circling the star, right? This is nothing. This is nothing in the vastness of this universe. What are these stars like? Well, they're like people, who hang out here, and I don't know what's happening. It's quite remarkable, really, that there's so many stars, and we now know today from surveying all these stars that almost every star is likely to have its own planetary system. So, somewhere here, there's likely to be life. I think this is my 2 cents on the matter. Okay, so on that note, I am done, and I will show you a really nice film from the International Space Station. Thank you. So these are aurorae. It's a difficult word to pronounce, but so the green stuff is essentially the high energy particles from the solar wind. They're just pushed out by the sun that interact with this ionosphere of the Earth, or the high layers, upper layers of the sun, of the Earth. And so when these high energy particles collide, you have emissions of light like this. They're quite remarkable. You can usually see them in sort of the very high latitudes in winter. Lightning storms, of course. Some of them are. I think it is. It is real, isn't it? It's real color. Yeah. Yeah, that's the remarkable thing about aurorae. I mean, they're just spectacular. I've never seen one. I've been to Alaska, but I've unfortunately the wrong time of the season. You have to go in winter, deep dark winter, and then they come. You don't know when they're going to come. You just have to wait. And they come, and they're supposedly quite magnificent. Yes. There's lightning storms are quite cool too.
In 1859, there was a flare so large that the aurorae were visible in the West Indies.
That's a volcano.
I remember 1859.
I went down there. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank Shravan Hanasoge.